All right. It looks like it is about time to start. Let me just make sure everything's going fine on this stream. Hi, everybody. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm from the sociology department here at Queen's College and co-director of the Queen's Podcast Lab. And today, I am very, very happy to be inviting a great guest, an expert on creativity and the arts, Hannah Wohl from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Hannah is the author of Bound by Creativity, How Contemporary Art is Created and Judged. And well, you know what? Rather than me explain, maybe I'll get Hannah to give an introduction, but very quickly, she's a sociologist who delved into the world of art to look at what separates the creative genius of the art world from your regular old artist. How are these reputations created? How does the creative process work? And I'm hoping to mine some of the insights that she gleaned in the field and see what we can learn about content creation. So Hannah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start off, can you just tell us a little bit about your research, just so we know where you're coming from?
Yeah, so I was really interested in this question of how do artists make creative decisions about how to make their work? We can also think of this as aesthetic judgments. How do they make aesthetic judgments in the absence of clear criteria for what makes good art? And so the contemporary art world was a really interesting place for me to study this. This is a question you could ask across creative industries. I know a lot of you are content producers, but I think the contemporary art world really epitomized this because there is such a lack of consensus in this world about what makes good art. It's a world where really anything goes in terms of art. So I collected about 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork, as well as interviews with artists, dealers, curators, art advisors, and collectors in the New York City contemporary art world to look at this question. And I ended up focusing on this idea of creative visions, looking at how artists make what they view as a distinctive creative vision. Sometimes we use the term signature style, but that can be used pejoratively in the art world. So I talk about this in terms of creative visions, as well as how do other people recognize and evaluate these creative visions, and how do the ways that other people evaluate these creative visions shape what artists feel that they can successfully make.
That's amazing. So from what I gather in your book, there are lots of talented artists out there, but there are only a few that become like the toast of the town, right? The real creative visionaries. What separates that, technically competent artists from like the ones whose creativity is praised?
So that's a great question. I'll say, first of all, technical competence is actually not required. So in the art world, it's not about, at least in the contemporary art world, and this is actually what makes contemporary art distinctive from other forms of art, it's not about making something beautiful or even something that requires technical skill, but something that captures an idea with a form. So if the idea requires technical skill, then you should have it. But if it doesn't, then it could be a banana taped to a wall. It can be a pile of rubble. It can be a clothesline of socks. It can be, in the case of one artist that I interviewed, frozen cat food. So technical skill, not a requirement for being a very successful artist. So to now move to your question of like what separates these artists from everyone else. So first of all, I interviewed not the superstars. Like I didn't interview Jeff Koons, for example. I interviewed people moving from pretty emerging. So like the people that shortly had recently graduated from MFA programs everyone I interviewed was trying to be a professional in the art world, or was a professional in the art world. So, at the one end, it was people that had just, maybe a few group shows, and that was one end of the poll. The other end was pretty established artists, had major retrospective exhibitions, had a lot of museum exhibitions, had been successfully showing their work for several decades, and generally made their money off of selling their artwork. So that was sort of the range I was looking at. And I think to everyone's disappointment, I won't be able to solve the secret of like what makes you successful. There's not one thing I can give you that's a sort of a magic. If you do this thing, you'll be wildly rich and famous and successful in the art world. And I think that's in part because of the instability around aesthetic judgment. I think what I can say is the artists who were successful were those who were judged to have distinctive creative visions that balanced this variation on the one hand and consistency on the other hand. So there were distinctive things that people could look at that person's body work and say, either that's a B Wertz, or at least I can see how that easily fits within his body of work. And the trick, I guess the really difficulty of it was maintaining that over the course of your career, not being a one-hit wonder, but making that thing that was distinctive and then changing it, but in a way that people still saw it as distinctively you. And that was something that artists really struggled with. So trying to maintain this balance of consistency and variation. And the reason why I can't give you like the secret to success is because that's not an objective threshold. Like that was the sort of whether or not there was enough consistency or variation was something that people sort of lacked consensus over as well. And I think, the other thing that separates the successful people from the unsuccessful people, and this is maybe sort of more obvious, but I think it needs to be said, is in the art world, status is really, really important. And because status is important, because there's no objective criteria for evaluating aesthetic judgment, for evaluating an art as good or bad. So you need to be associated with high status actors. So, and we call that, like status, like having like positive status signals in the art world. So,
wait, can I just, I just want to clarify. So what I gather from what you're saying is that success in the art world isn't necessarily that like you can paint realistically or do, I don't know what, because I have no aesthetic sense, so I can't even come up with examples, but it's like, it's reputational. And to ask in the art world, what makes somebody, one of the great artists, it's equivalent to asking what makes you popular at school or what makes you loved by other people. It's like, is that it? It's hard to predict because it's the defining characteristic of being successful in this field is other people's reaction to you, like their love of you or their, is that what you're getting at?
So yeah, that's sort of part of what I'm getting at now is that the reason why reputation matters so much in the art world is because there is nothing objective that we can say is like, okay, we can objectively evaluate this and sort of put it on a scale. So I won't get too down into the rabbit hole of sociology here, but there's a sociologist, Patrick Aspers, who calls creative markets status markets and compares these to other kinds of markets that he calls standard markets. And so standard market is like the market for oil. Like there's no question when you're driving your car about where you're going to like stop for gas. You're just trying to find the cheapest gas. And like, there's a reason sociologists don't study where people stop for gas because it just would not be interesting. There's no uncertainty around it. In the art world, there's this extreme uncertainty around value. And so to stabilize that uncertainty, we have to rest on status. And so to do that, that's why, in the art world, what gallery represents you really matters, and the status of that gallery. What museums are going to show your work, and museums are really high status in general. Some museums are higher status than others. What collectors are buying your work, who the other artists in the group show are, and their statuses. Your status is only as good as the status of everyone you're linked to. And you can see how, status can be contaminating in both a negative and positive way. So dealers will give up money sometimes to not sell to a collector that has a contaminated reputation. And so, like, for example, flippers are people that that turn around and resell work quickly, which can damage the artist's career in terms of like creating a boom and bust price point for their work, and is seen as like too economically oriented. So if you sell to a flipper, that contaminates the gallery status. It's seen as like not a good gallery, contaminates the artist. Everyone gets contaminated by association with this low status figure. And so protecting status is really important in the art world. But I would also say it's not, I don't want to boil this whole thing down to status, because I think I'm someone who thinks that experimentation and materiality is important as well. And so I do think there is something, even though it's really hard to talk about this in a sociological way, I think there is something about distinctiveness and the creative vision. So for example, like I talk in my book about this artist who made these webs of pipe cleaners, and they were really visually distinctive. And there's something physical about that. Like there's something that sticks in your mind because it's really visually distinctive. And to see this massive web of colored pipe cleaners sort of sprawling across a wall and hanging from the ceilings, like it's not something you forget. There is really something material there. And it also created a challenge for him because it was so visually distinctive that people couldn't forget it when he tried to make other things. And so I do think there's an important material aspect of this as well. And I think sociologists tend to ascribe everything to status. So I try to say, yes, status is important, but so is experimentation and materials.
In your book, you talk about creative vision. Like creative vision is sort of the identity of the scholar. Like, what does it mean concretely? Like, can you give us the details? What is involved in an artist's creative vision? And like, can you maybe apply it? How would that work for a YouTuber, for example, or a
interesting.
podcaster?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I like thinking about it across creative industries because I do think the concept is really generalizable. So I define creative visions as a cluster of consistencies that are core and enduring within an artist's body of work. And so and I look at this as not an objective thing. So when I talk about creative visions, I always talk about people's perceptions of creative visions. Like I can look at this and think this piece of art is about the feeling of melancholy, and you can look at it and think it's about genocide, and we'll both have different perceptions of that person's creative vision. So I see this as subjective, but intersubjective in that people sort of communicate over it and try to reach a consensus about what this work means. So in terms of what this looks like in contemporary art, you have both formal and conceptual elements. Like a formal element might be pipe cleaners as this medium that people associate with your body of work. A conceptual element might be the concept of domesticity. And these two are connected because the form is supposed to represent the idea in contemporary art. So if people don't see pipe cleaners as representing domesticity, then that's a problem. They have to see these things as linked. So, they need to be somewhat enduring and be seen as central to a body of work. Like I need to think that pipe cleaners are really part of what makes this artist's work distinctive, and it's important. They're committed to it. But these also change over time. So the creative vision isn't supposed to be stagnant. You're not supposed to be a one-trick pony. So you can sort of add in elements, expand the boundaries of the creative vision, try to renegotiate those boundaries over time. And so you can think of this in other creative industries. I think like you can think of like signature dishes in a restaurant and how those become representative of someone's creative vision. And in the art world, we often talk about like iconic works. Certain works contain more of the central features of a creative vision and are seen to better epitomize that creative vision. I'm trying to think about how this would translate to YouTube because I also don't watch a ton of YouTube videos.
No.
So I'm trying to think about this, but I think there are different elements that would matter. So one would be maybe like the style of like the tone of the videos maybe. And I'm talking about this as someone with much less experience about it. The content I think is definitely really important. But I think something that differentiates creative visions from things like from concepts like genre is that it's much more fine-grained than a genre. So,
Right.
you know, this artist it really is important that this artist is not merely a sculptor. He specifically does work with pipe cleaners because a sculptor, that gives you actually a lot more freedom than you're the pipe cleaner guy. And so I think those distinctive elements within a genre is what really matters. So,
like, for example, could it be like, so for example, within the true crime subgenre of, let's say, a podcast, there are some people who are like gritty and grisly, and they're known for using like old news clips, whereas someone else might be, I don't know, more analytical. And so it's like, is it like features of audience experience that they keep on coming back for and that they come to associate the brand with? Is that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. And I think one thing that's important is that it's not just one feature, but it's a cluster of features, and it's a cluster that that coalesces together in a distinctive form. And so, like, okay, so true crime podcasts, for example. So you have like grittiness. So maybe there's multiple gritty true crime podcasts, but only one person who's gritty plus X plus Y plus Z, and does it in a particular way. And together that makes them have a distinctive style. And then I think, the one idea that's really important is that it's not just like, we're not just judging discrete artworks or our creative objects. So, if you listen to one podcast episode, you might get a sense from that one thing but you're really judging that one object. And it's really in listening to multiple podcast episodes. And then maybe if the creator actually makes a different podcast and you start listening to their second podcast after you listen to this whole series, that's when you gain a sense not just of this one discrete object, but of this person as having a body of work, and that body of work having certain enduring consistency. And you start to have expectations that you think should be fulfilled. So if someone moves from true crime to makeup tutorials, that might be too jarring of a change. And you want to see that there's certain enduring traits, but also that they continue to grow.
That's it. So I just want to stop for a moment and say, for those of you joining us on Zoom or YouTube, if you have questions or comments for Hannah, you can put them in the box, or those of you on Zoom, you can just raise your hand. Let's pivot for a second and talk about the creative process of successful artists. How do you succeed at being creative?
Yeah, I think that's a question I often ask myself as a academic and someone who writes. And so I think continued efforts at experimentation is the important thing. So one thing I look at is how artists experiment in their studios, what their actual processes of experimentation are. And the way I did this, because it would have been really, I think, not helpful and really time consuming and unprofitable for me to just sit in an artist's studio and stare at them while they drew for 6 months. So I visited different artist studios and I asked them about artworks at different stages of production. So, okay, how did you make this? Why did you choose to make this sketch into a full scale work? Or why did you put this work in storage? Or why did you not finish this? or and then I would often visit their studios multiple times. Like every few months I would come back and see how things had changed. So I was trying to sort of look at the creative process at different stages of development and understand how it worked. And so I looked at so artists do a lot of low stakes experimentation. That's sort of my phrase for it. And by this I mean sort of fast tests that are sort of efficiently efficiently using time and resources. So like sketches or models are a good example of this. And this allows them to test out new variables while also, conserving their limited resources. And so, and I found that emotion was really important in this process. So when artists feel excited about things, they tend to repeat that element and test it in different ways. And so artists actually, we often think of like art and science as really diametrically opposite, but artists actually used what scientists would think of as like a simple experiment.
Mm-hmm.
They would maintain one variable and then change other variables. And this allowed them to see how the element would react to changes. So for example, like one artist I studied was making these like leather slabs that she would burn, and she would pour cement over. And so she took leather and used leather of different thicknesses and poured cement over it, and to see how the leather would react at different thicknesses to cement being poured over it. So this was like a simple experiment. As she tests it out in different ways, she understands how the leather is going to react. And then she can make full-scale works without worrying about, okay, this is going to take me like 2 days to make. And if it messes up, then I've wasted like the time and money here. And so artists allow for heightened uncertainty earlier in the process. And then as they understand the material results through these simple experiments, they reduce the uncertainty. And through that process, they build what I call creative competencies. And this is basically heightened understandings of the results of their work. And so, I started by talking about how technical skill is not needed, but this is the kind of skill that artists build up. And so sometimes it is technical skill, sometimes it is more conceptual. Like I worked with this in so many different ways, and I understood how these concepts sort of were associated through this repeated process. And so I think emotions were really important. Like when they got bored, they tended to stop doing things and move to a different element. When they felt ambivalence, they would sort of leave it hanging on the wall while they worked on different things. And then, one thing the sort of last thing I wanted to bring up about this is that consistencies naturally arose through this process. And so, through the act of doing this simple experiment, maintaining one element while repeating by maintaining one element while varying other elements to see how it reacts, you're actually creating like several works with this consistent element. And so that is how a series would emerge, and artists in a solo show typically show a series. So they experiment. In experimenting, they produce this series, which has this consistent element. When they produce this consistent element, they look back on it and say, oh, that must be this enduring element in this work. This must be something that's important to my creative vision. And then they incorporate that conceptually and mentally into their view of their creative vision and also communicate it to other people. And so the creative vision isn't something that artists conceive of in their mind and then simply execute through experimentation. It actually emerges through the process of experimentation in ways that are really unpredictable to artists often. And so, I think we can get really annoyed with artists as sociologists when they talk about like, oh, it's all intuitive, or like, I can't tell you how I make what I make. It's created and we can be really cynical about that. But I think it's like, there is some truth to that. Yes, that's the myth of what it means to be a creative, but it's also the experience of working in a studio or maybe YouTubing or anything where you aren't actually predicting it fully in advance. And it does feel like it kind of emerges through the process.
I have a question about that reaction or that experimentation, because it sounds a lot like A/B testing in marketing, or what they do in marketing research when they're fielding a product. And it's sort of what we encourage our students to undergo, that type of test marketing logic as well. How much of the artist's own energy did you perceive was a product of other people's reception of the work versus like some type of internal satisfaction? Because when you imagine an artist, I'm sure the image they project is that all that matters is that, my vision, my unique, weird vision is fulfilled. But like, how much of the energy that you saw was rooted in a reaction where someone's like, man, this is testing really well, I might be able to make money on this?
Yeah, I think that's not something you can separate out. I don't think you can say this is like the true me and this is the me that's responding to other people. And one of the sort of interventions I wanted to make in the book was to say, okay, when we study creativity as sociologists, when we look at the creative process, in almost every study I can think of, we're looking at something that's interactive and we're studying how collaboration shapes that process. So, okay, like how does a trio of jazz musicians collaborate in the process, for example, or how do people in a kitchen collaborate to make a restaurant dish? And this is because we're deeply rooted in this idea that that we're trying to debunk this creative genius myth. And we're trying to say, no, there's no solitary creative genius here. And so in the art world, while a lot of more successful artists will have studio assistants who are sort of helping with different stages of the process, most of the time artists aren't in their studios alone. And what I wanted to say was, even in these moments of solitude, these are still social moments of judgment. And so I think you can't separate out the sort of true artist intrinsic motivation from the extrinsic, because I don't think artists can even sort of peel that apart in their brains, because artists are constantly in communication with other people in the art world. They're going to different exhibitions, they're having exhibitions, they're talking to their dealer, they're having peers visit their studio. And so they're constantly getting these various inputs. And then I think, they don't even know in their mind the extent to which, like, the response is fundamentally social. Like, their perceptions of their creative visions are fundamentally produced not only in their studio, but through the communication process of them communicating to others what their creative vision is, and seeing other people respond to it. And I think there are some points where you see that as clearly sort of an economic trade-off, and some points where it doesn't seem like there's the same sort of trade-off. And artists are only, I think, sort of aware of the difference when it feels like it's sort of chafing against what they want to do. So one point where I saw that really clearly was when artists became really known for something distinctive, like the pipe cleaners, and then became bored and faced pressure to continue to produce that element. And so it was this like feeling of being pigeonholed that showed that sort of constraint from the social world. But a lot of times they saw that as like a productive thing to be in conversation with other people. And I think, there is this tendency to think of the creative vision as purely this like artist responding to this economic imperative by other people to like fit what other people think of them as and want them to be. But I also think the ideas of the creative vision are also something that artists are almost like authentically committed to. So artists buy into this idea that you should be truly like committed to certain elements, that certain elements should be enduring because you have this enduring fascination with them. And artists also buy into the idea that you should continue to push yourself and experiment. So they think of being a good artist as having this balance of variation and consistency, and that's not just about being a successful artist, but also being a good artist. And there's moments where it can chafe, but it's also part of their narrative of creativity.
Couple comments just from the chat boxes that I'll pass along. Jason Tuga writes that his nephew worked for a gallery and nailed that banana to the wall at Art Basel.
That's very cool. so yeah, that was a scandal recently in the art world where where there was a banana duct taped to a wall that someone then came by and ate in the middle of the fair. And there's sort of these annual scandals that are always playing at the same thing, which is the sort of incredulousness people have that other people will pay like insane amounts of money for like quote unquote things your 4-year-old could do.
Yeah.
This was it was a pretty funny one, but this was this year. Well, I think last year's version of that. Oh, I see Ryan.
Dustin.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. What'd you say? Oh, Ryan. Sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, great. Thanks. I think that this art market is so strange, the contemporary art market, like compared to other things in terms of success and who gets ahead. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the gatekeepers in this art market, because I think if you write a really good book, although there's gatekeepers everywhere, but if you write a good book or a movie, eventually like the audience takes over and you become successful in spite of the barriers, although there's structures everywhere. But in the contemporary art market, it just seems so driven by your agent, by your exposure. And the agent especially has so much power in that who they select to show in the gallery, who they select to shop to the really high-end buyers and things like that. And for the ordinary people, I like contemporary art, but when I go there, I'm going to the museum that's already been curated, right? Mm-hmm. We just kind of accept what's already given, because we don't know that much about it. So what is the role of the gatekeepers, and is it very different than other art worlds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say one huge gatekeeper, the first gatekeeper is MFA programs. And there's a really important class dynamic to this. So MFA programs are extremely expensive. Similarly to PhDs, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a job. There's no job to get when you get out. There's no salaried job to get, but there's no guarantee of money at the end of that path. And unlike the PhD, you have to pay a lot of money for it. So it's something that's like pretty economically risky, where you have to have either family money or go into a lot of debt. But that is a place where you learn to start articulating your creative vision, and where you also gain the beginnings of a professional network that's going to then follow you when you quote unquote enter the art world. And Gary Fine has a really wonderful book on MFA programs called Talking Art, if you're interested in that. And then once you're in the art world, there's several kinds of gatekeepers. There's curators who are either freelance or working for museums, and then there are dealers who have galleries. And so the way that works is, and there's galleries of different statuses. So there's galleries for emerging artists and for established artists. And first, the goal is to be represented by a good gallery. And the gallery, once it represents you, will take 50% of your sales. They'll have a solo show for you, like every couple of years. They'll put you in group shows, and they'll sort of tap you into their network of collectors. And the way you get represented is by having first, like they'll put you in a couple group shows. Then you might get your first solo show, and after 1 or 2 solo shows, your work is selling. Then they'll usually offer representation. So dealers are a really important gatekeeper, and the status of the dealer really matters in terms of that. And dealers are finding artists either from lower status dealers. That's a really big problem in the art world, is like poaching, where sort of emerging galleries feel like we built up the career of this artist, and then just because we did well, because we were successful and really like committed to this artist, the artist became successful. And then instead of getting to cash out on that, the second the artist was successful, the artist was plucked by a higher status gallery. And of course, it's in the artist's interest to go with the higher status gallery, because status is what really matters in the art world. And so that's been a really big struggle. I think often we think of producers as precarious workers, but like over 90% of galleries close within the first couple of years. And I think galleries face a lot of precarity as well in the art world. And so, that's, so at the higher status levels, galleries are plucking successful artists at the lower status levels. For emerging dealers, they rely a lot actually on networks of artists, because they see artists as having this sort of on the ground knowledge of what's going on in the art world. And so that's kind of why it's important to go to MFA programs. And when you exit MFA programs, a lot of artists find contingent labor in the art world, like being assistants from more established artists. And that can be also a really important, it's not just like about like getting that hourly pay, but that's actually really important for mobility also. And then one last thing I'll say about galleries is that, a lot of people focus on their role as like selectors, as gatekeepers. Which ones do they select? I also think what's really important about galleries, which has been, or gatekeeping in general, and this has been discussed a lot less, is how they guide the meaning of artwork or creative products more broadly. So they're not just selecting the artists, they're then, once they're representing them, they're guiding how audiences are perceiving the meaning of the work. And so they do this by what I call style scripts, or scripts about the meaning of the creative vision. And so they'll talk to collectors informally when they come in about, this is what this artist does, this is their body of work, this is how this current exhibition represents the body of work. They produce books and catalogs where they are able to trace that creative trajectory. And they also work with the artist to write artist statements and press releases for each exhibition that explains the meaning. So these sort of written and verbal statements go hand in hand with the objects themselves.
Let's talk about biography for a second. One thing that was interesting is how you talked about how dealers and the artists themselves would almost generate backstories that would be basically part of the, it seems like it's part of the package of the art. When you're buying the art, you're buying like a piece of a story that's been constructed. And that part resonated, because I think with podcasting and YouTube, often people are communing with the host, and it's not just about the show the host makes, but it's like who the host is and what they represent. Could you talk to us a little bit about how artists, like the job of creating an identity and managing an identity and creating a biography, like how do they do it? How do they create a persona like they do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think there's sort of a lot to unpack there. One is that, artists' perceptions of their own identity absolutely matter for how they create their creative vision, because they think that you need to be authentically committed to an idea or a theme for it to be in your creative vision. So, it's no accident that more of the female artists I interviewed felt that like feminism and gender and domesticity were important themes in their work, because this was resonating with their lived experience and their perception of their identity. So I think these like sort of social categories were important in sort of how artists drew from source material to experiment with in the creative process. And in terms of artists sort of interfacing with their audiences, how, because other people also connected this idea of, you have to have this like authentic connection to your creative vision and this enduring commitment to it, they were also associating the artist's creative vision with the artist's identity. And so because of that, they not only, I mean, that was kind of what they felt they were buying when they bought the art. They were buying the creative vision, and the creative vision was attached to the artist. And so they really wanted often to know the artist and to at least get to meet the artist who they felt like that allowed them to better understand the creative vision. And so collectors liked doing studio visits in part because they felt like meeting the artist and seeing the environment in the studio helped them understand this creative vision. And I think artists, beyond this idea of social categories, artists tried to enact this persona of what it meant to have a true creative vision. And so there was this enacting of ideas of, willingness to experiment and aesthetic commitment in the personality of the artist. So for example, artists sort of tried to show dealers that they had this aesthetic obsession, that they had these sort of obsessive traits. They tried to show collectors that they did not care about money, that they were really truly only committed to their art. And they often sort of highlighted their uniqueness and their distinctiveness by being really unconventional and eccentric in front of artists. So by sort of acting out in certain ways. And so, for example, artists would often dress really unconventionally, even showing up in unconventional clothing to their own gallery exhibitions. They would, I had one artist who was a professor and, despite being a professor, sort of enacted this starving artist persona where we would pick up, like, he would ask for expired foods at bodegas. And that was sort of what he was sort of very publicly trying to live off of. And there was a, article in the New Yorker about how he, forced his students to sleep in cold buildings and shower with hoses to prepare themselves for the life of the artist. And so they were really, there were some limits to that. They were saying, I'm not actually trying to be starving. I would like to make money, but they really tried to show people that they put aesthetics above money, that they were these eccentric creative people, that, they were obsessed with the things that they made.
I really enjoyed that part of your book. And part of it was, I remember back in graduate school, a lot of young people think that eccentricity is a byproduct of genius. And they sort of embrace the eccentric behavior as a means of, fully embracing the role of a genius. And to hear this, what you're telling me is a lot of these artists, they put on the eccentricity because of the social expectations of how a creative person would be. You can't have khakis and a polo shirt.
Yeah. And I would say, while they're somewhat conscious of it, I think, so to bring in sociology a bit more, there's this sociologist Irving Goffman, who looks at self-impression management. So how do we present ourselves in ways that will be viewed acceptable to others, and not only acceptable, but good to others. And so one of his insights that I find, and so he talks about, we're always performing a self. There's nothing other than performance of self. There's no core enduring self behind the performance. It's only a mask. And one of the things I really like about his insight is that we don't just perform for other people, we perform for ourselves. So even when we're alone, we're still doing a performance of self. And so I think it's the same with the artists, where they want other people to see them as authentic artists, but they want to see themselves as authentic artists as well. And so they buy into this persona as much as anyone else.
All right, we're running out of time. Hannah's got a busy schedule. Just one more thing before we go. First of all, thank you so much. I've loved talking with you today.
Oh, thank you.
For somebody who is an aspiring creative in any medium, who wants to know, what do I have to do to succeed, to be creative? Like, what should I do, Dr. Wohl? Can you give them any advice, any just simple tips to set them in the right direction?
So, one thing we talked about was, and it sort of pains me to recommend this because I think there's a lot of issues with this, but we were talking about MFA programs, and I do think professional networking is really, really important. And it pains me because I think there's a lot of class issues there, and sort of a lot of like elitism baked in with that. But if I'm being honest, I think we see this in our own field of academia, that our professional network is really important. I'm on this podcast right now, and I think that is important in any art world, and just really heightened in art worlds more than other professions because of this idea that there's no objective, criteria that we can point to. So all we have is status to rely on. So that would be, I think, the first thing. I would also say, going back to this idea of creative visions, that it really taught me about this balance of distinctiveness and variation. And so, distinctiveness is really important, especially at the early career stage when you're trying to get your foot in the door. To do something that's distinctive is the only way to get recognized. But it also, doing this project taught me about the dangers of distinctiveness. And I talked to a lot of artists later in their careers who really regretted choices that they had made earlier on in their careers that they felt had boxed them in. And so there's a very difficult trade-off there, because you have to be distinctive to get in the door, but then your distinctiveness can become like a cage, basically. If you become too known for something in the art world, especially if it was a narrow formal element, like pipe cleaners, that can be something that becomes almost too distinctive, becomes so baked in people's minds that they can't associate you with other things. And so I think being aware of that pretty early on and trying to build more elements that people come to see as distinctive, and elements that you feel like you can continue to explore without becoming bored in those elements. And so artists who I think were the most sort of creatively satisfied, that were established artists, were the ones who became known for like pretty broad conceptual themes that they could explore across media and techniques. But that's a really hard thing to do because it's less visually recognizable. So I just think I think that's such a tough thing to do. I think you need to do something pretty distinctive early on that's maybe widely recognizable, but then iterate from that and change your work pretty quickly after that, to try to avoid this issue of pigeonholing, and effectively communicate to your audience how those new things that look pretty different are connected to those things that you became known for. So yeah, a really hard task ahead.
Professor Hannah Wohl, author of Bound by Creativity: How Contemporary Art is Created and Judged by the University of Chicago Press. She's in the sociology department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, before I close off, just a couple final words. One is, join us next Friday. We're going to have Steve Von Doren from Von Doren Legal to talk about the basics of liability and intellectual property law, and some big issues to think about when you are creating content. A couple more things. Hold on. If you like this programming, remember that it is brought to you by the state and city of New York. These are your tax dollars at work. If you'd like to support what we're doing at the Queen's Podcast Lab, visit our website, queenspodcastlab.org, and click donate. And you can make a tax-deductible donation through the Department of Sociology at the City University of New York to help our project not only does it help do things like purchase resources to make non-commercial educational products and give aspiring young people internships and learning opportunities, but it also communicates to our superiors here at the college that people value this type of work. Thank you very much for joining us. For those of you on the Zoom, stand by. I'm going to end the live stream. So goodbye to everybody on the live stream, and we will see you next week.